The guitar rested across Jimmy's lap. Bob Dylan was still talking. And then, quietly, everything changed. Greenwich Village. Winter 1968. A fourth-floor apartment on Bleecker Street with thin walls and thinner heat. 7 people in a room barely big enough for 5. 2 guitars. No audience. No stage. Just wood floors, 1 floor lamp, and the kind of silence that meant something was about to matter. Bob Dylan sat in a wooden chair, his acoustic guitar leaning against the armrest. Jimi Hendrix sat on the floor across from him, cross-legged, his Stratocaster resting in his lap like it had always been there. The other 5 people, musicians, friends, hangers-on, sat against the walls or on the windowsill, watching. They'd been talking for maybe 20 minutes. Music. Technique. The difference between performing and playing. Dylan had been holding court the way he sometimes did when he felt like testing someone. Not cruel. Just probing. Seeing what was real and what was costume. "You play loud," Dylan said. It wasn't quite a question. Not quite an accusation. Somewhere in between. Jimmy didn't look up from his guitar. His fingers moved slowly across the fretboard, not playing, just touching. Feeling. Sometimes. That's your thing, right? Volume. Feedback. The whole spectacle. Sometimes, Jimmy said again. Dylan leaned forward. Can you play without all that? Without what? The amplification. The effects. The theater. Dylan gestured vaguely toward Jimmy's guitar. Just voice and guitar. Just the song. Nothing else. The room got quieter. Not silent, there was still the sound of radiator pipes and distant traffic, but quieter in a way that made everyone sit up a little straighter. Jimmy looked up. His expression hadn't changed. Calm. Present. Like Dylan had just asked him what time it was. Yeah. Prove it. That night in a small Greenwich Village apartment, Bob Dylan proposed a test. And when Jimi Hendrix answered, Dylan couldn't speak, and 7 people witnessed history. The challenge wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But everyone in the room understood what was happening. Dylan was drawing a line. Saying, I know who I am. I know what I do. Do you? Jimmy stood up slowly. He unplugged his Stratocaster from the small practice amp in the corner, an amp that had been sitting there unused, just in case. He sat back down on the floor. The guitar was now completely acoustic, just wood and strings and whatever Jimmy decided to do with them. What do you want to hear? Jimmy asked. Dylan thought for a moment. Then, play one of yours. Which one? The one that matters most to you. Jimmy's fingers found the strings. For maybe 10 seconds, he didn't play anything. Just held the guitar. Felt it. The room waited. And then he began. The song was Little Wing. But it wasn't the version anyone would hear on the album. It was stripped. Bare. Just guitar and voice. No drums. No bass. No studio magic. Just Jimmy and 6 strings and whatever existed in the space between them. His voice came in soft. Almost fragile. The way someone sings when they're alone and think nobody's listening. The guitar followed, not leading, not showing off, just there. Supporting. Breathing with the words. Well, she's walking through the clouds. Dylan's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just a tightening around the eyes. A shift in posture. He leaned back slightly in his chair, like he needed more space to take in what he was hearing. The guitar part was complex, intricate fingerpicking, subtle chord movements, harmonic touches that shouldn't have been possible on an unplugged Stratocaster. But Jimmy made it sound inevitable. Like the song had always existed this way and was just being remembered rather than performed. With a circus mind that's running wild. One of the people against the wall. A session guitarist named Marcus who'd played with everyone from the Byrds to the Mamas and the Papas, slowly shook his head. Not in disagreement. In disbelief. He'd been in studios with Jimmy. He'd seen the volume, the effects, the controlled chaos. This was something else entirely. This was architecture without walls. The song continued. Jimmy's eyes were closed. His head moved slightly with the rhythm, not a performance gesture, just the natural movement of someone deep inside the music. His fingers found notes that seemed to hang in the air after they were played, like the room itself had become part of the instrument. Dylan hadn't moved. His hands were still clasped together, but his knuckles had gone white. His mouth was slightly open, like he'd started to say something 30 seconds ago and forgotten how to finish the sentence. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. The second verse came quieter than the first. Jimmy's voice dropped to almost a whisper, and somehow it filled the entire room. The guitar followed, not louder but denser. More present. Each note seemed to contain more information than should have been possible. Butterflies and zebras and moonbeams. The thing about Little Wing is that it's a love song. But not the obvious kind. It's about protection. About someone who exists just slightly outside the world, and the tenderness required to exist beside them without crushing them. Jimmy sang it like he was alone. Like these 7 people didn't exist. Like Bob Dylan, who had written half the protest anthems of the decade, who had changed popular music twice already and was about to do it again, wasn't sitting 5 feet away judging him. He sang it like the song mattered more than his ego. The guitar part shifted. For maybe 8 bars, Jimmy stopped singing entirely. Just played. And the melody he created, still completely acoustic, still just wood and strings, told the rest of the story. The part where words run out and only music remains. Dylan's head dropped slightly. He wasn't looking at Jimmy anymore. He was looking at the floor between them, processing something. Marcus, against the wall, had tears on his face. He didn't wipe them away. Just let them sit there while he listened. Another person in the room, a young journalist named Sarah who'd been invited by someone who'd been invited by someone else, was supposed to be taking notes for a piece on the village music scene. Her notebook sat closed in her lap. She'd forgotten why she was there. The song built toward its conclusion. Not louder. Not faster. Just more. Jimmy's voice returned for the final lines, and the guitar wrapped around the words like smoke. "It's all right," she said, "it's all right." The last note hung in the air. Jimmy let it fade naturally. Didn't cut it off. Didn't add anything. Just let it die the way sounds die when nothing keeps them alive. Then silence. Real silence. The radiator had stopped hissing. The traffic outside seemed to have paused. The 7 people in that room didn't move. Jimmy opened his eyes slowly. Looked at his guitar like he was just remembering it was there. Then looked at Dylan. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. Dylan didn't speak immediately. He sat in his chair, hands still clasped, staring at some point in the middle distance. Maybe 10 seconds passed. Maybe 15. Time felt negotiable. Finally, Dylan stood up. He walked over to where Jimmy sat on the floor. Didn't say anything. Just extended his hand. Jimmy took it. Dylan pulled him up. "I was wrong," Dylan said quietly. "About what?" "I thought you were a guitar player who sang. You're a songwriter who happens to use a guitar." Jimmy didn't respond. Just held his Stratocaster loosely at his side, like they were old friends who didn't need to talk much. Dylan turned to his own guitar, still leaning against the chair. He picked it up. Sat back down. "Can I try something?" "Yeah." Dylan started playing. It was one of his own songs, one from the Blonde on Blonde sessions, complex and literary and full of the kind of internal rhymes that made other lyricists give up. But he played it differently than he had on the album. Simpler. Quieter. Like he just learned something about the difference between complexity and depth. Jimmy sat back down on the floor. Listened. Didn't pick up his own guitar. Just listened. When Dylan finished, he looked at Jimmy. "Was I hiding?" "From what?" "From the song." behind the words. Jimi thought about this. Sometimes we build things because we're scared of what happens if we stop building. Dylan nodded slowly. Set his guitar down. You want to know something? I've been playing music for 15 years. I've written songs that changed how people think about songs. And I just learned something about music from watching you play 4 minutes on an unplugged electric guitar in a room with 7 people. What did you learn? That volume isn't about amplifiers. The room was still silent. Marcus against the wall had stopped crying, but his face hadn't changed. Sarah the journalist had opened her notebook, but she hadn't written anything. Just stared at the blank page like it might explain what she just witnessed. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. Jimi stood up again. Walked to the small practice amp in the corner. Plugged his Stratocaster back in. Turned it on. The amp hummed softly. Now can I show you the loud version? He asked. Dylan laughed. Actually laughed. The tension broke. The room exhaled. Yeah, Dylan said. Show me the loud version. Jimi played Little Wing again. This time with volume. With effects. With all the tools he'd built his reputation on. But it was different now. Everyone could hear it. The architecture was the same. The foundation hadn't changed. He just turned the lights on to show them what was already there. The loud version wasn't hiding anything. It was revealing. When it ended, Dylan stood and shook Jimi's hand again. Thank you. For what? For reminding me why I started. What followed stayed with everyone in the room. Long after the last note faded. They talked for another hour after that. About songs. About the difference between being heard and being understood. About the trap of becoming what people expect. Dylan told stories about his early days in the village, when nobody knew who he was and he could just play. Jimi talked about the Chitlin circuit, about playing backup for Little Richard and the Isley Brothers before anyone knew his name. The 7 people in that room never forgot it. Marcus told the story for the rest of his life, how he watched Jimi Hendrix teach Bob Dylan something about music using nothing but an unplugged guitar and a 4-minute song. Sarah wrote about it eventually, years later, when both men were gone and the story felt like it belonged to history rather than her notebook. Dylan went back to Woodstock the next morning. 6 months later, he released John Wesley Harding. An album stripped of almost everything, just voice and guitar and whatever lived between them. Critics called it a radical departure. Dylan never said why he made it. Jimi kept playing loud. Kept pushing amplifiers to their limits. Kept creating sounds nobody had heard before. But people who saw him in small venues, in practice spaces, in hotel rooms where he'd pull out an acoustic and just play, they said it was different after that night. Like he'd proven something to himself and didn't need to prove it again. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The apartment on Bleecker Street doesn't exist anymore. The building was torn down in the 1980s. Nobody marked it. Nobody preserved it. But sometimes young musicians come to that block and sit on the curb where it used to be, and they play quiet songs on unplugged guitars, and they don't know why it feels important. 3 years after that night, Jimi Hendrix died in London. He was 27 years old. Bob Dylan played at the tribute concert. He performed Little Wing, just voice and guitar, the way Jimi had played it that night in the apartment. When he finished, someone in the audience shouted, "Play it loud!" Dylan shook his head. He already did. The guitar Jimi played that night, the Stratocaster he unplugged to prove Dylan's point, stayed with him until the end. In photographs from his final year, you can see it in the background of hotel rooms and dressing rooms. He never sold it. Never gave it away. After Jimi died, his brother Leon found something in the guitar case. A setlist from 1968, written in Jimi's handwriting. At the bottom, in different ink, like it had been added later, were 2 words. Just listen. That apartment on Bleecker Street had thin walls. The neighbors heard everything. Mrs. Kowalski, who lived next door, was 73 years old and had never heard of either Bob Dylan or Jimi Hendrix. But she heard the music that night. Years later, she told her grandson, "I don't know who was playing, but whoever it was understood something about loneliness." She was right. Little Wing isn't about spectacle. It's about seeing someone clearly and choosing tenderness. That night, Jimi showed Dylan, and the 7 witnesses, that the loudest statement you can make is sometimes the quietest one. The test Dylan proposed wasn't really about volume. It was about truth. Can you strip away everything you hide behind and still matter? Can you be heard when you're not trying to be heard? Jimi answered without defending himself. Without explaining. He just played the song the way it asked to be played. And Bob Dylan, who had built a career on words, found himself without any.